Hello, everybody. I'll introduce myself. My name is Kiara Yates. I'm not Nicole Soto. I just fill in for her now that she has moved to a different type of job, always within SNHU. I am a macro and microeconomics instructor, and I've been with Southern New Hampshire since 2012. Right now, we're going to start with microeconomics. So we're going to go over the requirements of Milestone 1. It's going to be fairly easy and fast because Milestone 1 is pretty much just an introduction to the firm you have chosen for your research throughout the course. So during Module 1, you were supposed to choose a firm and let your instructor know which firm you chose to make sure that it was a firm that met the requirements needed for the milestones. One important requirement is that it's a publicly traded firm, because this will allow you to find all the financial information you will need to complete the final project. Milestone 1, all you have to do is introduce your firm. To begin your paper, you want to use an active voice, not a passive voice. So you can use the I. You're pretending to be basically an economic consultant for the firm. And you will explain in your introduction why you're researching the firm, what the purpose of your research is going to be throughout the course, and how your research will inform your conclusions. So why are you carrying out the research? Use some microeconomic terms like that you're going to research supply and demand and the market share and some market trends of the company. And why are you doing the research? You're doing this research because you're going to provide some recommendations for the firm for the future and for their growth. You do not need to provide the recommendations in the introduction. You just need to explain that this is the intent of your paper. How do we know the whys? Lynette, what do you mean, how do we know the whys? Well, the why is why you're doing the research. You're doing the research because you're going to inform your conclusion. You're going to provide recommendations. So you're going to do an economic analysis of your firm so that at the end of the paper you can provide recommendations. As I said, you don't provide the recommendations in the introduction, obviously, because you haven't done the research yet. You're just explaining what you're going to do. Once you have introduced your paper, so you have provided just an introspection of what work you're going to carry out throughout the course, what the purpose of your paper is, you can focus on the history of the company. The history of the company, when was it founded, who founded it? It might not have started as a publicly traded company. It might have started as a smaller company that then grew. And you want to make sure you provide a detailed history of the company. What kind of products does your company produce? Has it evolved its products, through time? It might have started like only producing, I don't know, shoes, and then it evolved into producing further sports apparels, for example. Or if you're choosing a car manufacturer, it might have changed from one type of vehicle to another type of vehicle, changed the focus of its production. Anyway, you just want to provide an overview of your company. You will be able to find that overview and the history of the company in the About section of the website of the firm you have selected. As I said, the Milestone 1 is pretty straightforward. Once you provide the purpose and you provide a history and an overview of your company. You have to be comprehensive in providing the history of the firm. And if your firm provides services, you have to explain what services they provide. If you're not comprehensive, you need improvement, obviously. So try to be comprehensive. And if you want to, you can even consult the rubric for the final project and try to fulfill the requirements to be exemplary. This way you don't have to go back and rework it before the final. If you use the about of the firm from the website, you have to cite the reference. Yes, Chandra, every time you guys use a source, you will have to cite it and reference it. Paraphrase, what you read. Paraphrasing means you read from the website, but you express the content in your own words. What if the company started producing not only for the public, but also for the government or military as well? Well, yeah, you can explain that. It gets a little bit more complicated when you have a company that produces mostly for the government and the military and less for the public sometimes, because the demand and supply trends will be different, since the demand from the government or military is going to be a little different than the demand you would get from the general public. So the whole purpose of, yes, Lynette, the whole purpose of the paper is to provide an economic analysis of the company. So that's what you're going to explain in the purpose. You're going to research demand and supply. You're going to research the costs of production. You're going to research the market, the price elasticity of demand. And then when you have all these elements, you'll be able to provide some recommendations for the future growth of the company. Marco, the copy of this template is available in the website, in the course, under the final project, the final essay resources. Amanda, you didn't really miss a lot. It's just really very short, milestone 1. You only have to go through the introduction and the history of the company. So there's not a lot to go over in terms of rubric requirements. Now, the last requirement that you have is to meet APA standard formatting, and that's probably one thing that you want to get right from the very beginning of the paper. You will need a title page like this. You need a running head, a title, author, and your affiliation. So you would write SNHU under there. You want to make sure just that you follow the guidelines of the template to meet the APA requirements. You cite every source and you reference every source following APA requirements. Yes, you want to use, well, in this, we recommend using the I because you are acting as a consultant for the firm. I don't know why, if your professor asks you not to use it, then you follow your instructor's direction. But the recommendation in general is to use the active voice, since you are acting as a consultant for the company, and this is basically your economic report for the company. The source to freshen up on APA, Laura, you can go on the Shapiro Library, and there's resources there that help you cite and reference. And then you can use this paper that will also, it gives you the guidelines. If you notice, if you read title paper, it says this template is formatted according to APA guidelines, where you need a Times New Roman font in 12-point, double-spaced, aligned flush left, and the paragraphs intended 5/7 spaces. It also, if you go to the end of the paper, I believe, it gives you example of references. So how to reference when you have the name of the author, the year of publication. It gives you guidelines, and there's also a link at the end of this paper that will give you examples of how to reference following APA format. So you can use this paper. Throughout this sample paper, you will find links, like for example, for firm concentration, that you can use to determine what type of market the firm is operating in, how to calculate the market share, the barriers to entry. You see all these blue links throughout the paper. You can use those, and it will direct you to websites and resources that you can use to help you through the research. Oh, thank you, Lily, for sharing the website. Nikki, if your links don't work, right-click on them, and when it says hyperlink, just select hyperlink and it'll direct you to it if you can't click on it directly. Lynette, what's the question about the introduction that you're stuck on? Well, Lynette, you just generally, Lynette is asking, how do we word our purpose before a detailed inquiry is made? Well, the purpose of the paper is to do an economic research, an economic investigation on the firm you chose, to identify strengths and weaknesses, to identify trends of demand and supply and market, the market conditions, so the market share and the market position of the firm, and to provide some recommendations for future growth of the firm. That's basically what your introduction needs to contain. Now, obviously, I said it in general terms. You will have to tailor that information to some initial research that you have done about your firm, mostly the history of the firm, where you will be able to identify some of the key aspects of your firm. One of the videos also said not to use. Nikki, which video are you talking about? Well, you can start using some economic terms, like what you need. If you look through the rubric, it'll tell you that you're going to do a supply and demand research. You're going to research price elasticity. So you could use some of the guidelines from the rubric to see what you're going to research. And then when you get to the end of the course and you're getting ready to do the final, you will be able to go back and revise the introduction and use more specific economic terms to be exemplary for the final. So I'm not talking about using in detail economic terms or explaining economic concepts. You're not in the condition right now to do that, but you can use some introductory economic terms, just terminology, since you are acting as a consultant. Use terms that relate to your firm. So use terminology within the firm appropriately. So if you're talking of Nike and sneakers, maybe be specific and use the word sneakers. Don't use the word shoes, just to be more specific. If you are researching, I don't know, vehicles, be specific in the terminology of the vehicles you're talking about. And you can use then the terminology from the website that you're going to be using for your research. Most of the information that you need for the final paper and for every milestone, in terms of history and information regarding the firm and the data of the firm, you should find on the firm's website. They are publicly traded firms, so you will find the financial statements, and then when you inside the financial statements, if you read them all, there's all the balances of the year. But at the bottom of the financial statements, there is comments and explanation of what happened throughout the year. It's worded, it's not numbers. It talks about the prospects for the company, for the future. So when you read those, you will be able to gather a lot of information on the company, on what the growth prospects of the company are, and you'll be able to use all this information in your milestones. But you won't need this for milestone 1 yet. For milestone 1, all you need to go look up is the history of your company. You can start with the history that they provide on their website, and you can expand on other websites or news articles that you might find that can interest you. But it's pretty self-explanatory to provide the history of the company. Don't do it too short, like 1 paragraph. I know it shows only 1 paragraph on this template. I think it should be a little bit longer, maybe at least 2 paragraphs, because 1 paragraph really does not give you enough insight on a company unless it's a brand new company, which is unlikely because a brand new company might not be too new of a company, might not be publicly traded yet. But the company's website is the best place to start your research for milestone 1. So you can, do you have any questions about maybe APA formatting? Because that seems to be one of the main issues sometimes with getting started with your assignments. Since the content is pretty straightforward for milestone 1, make sure you run a spelling and grammar check before posting. There's a lot of words that are spelled correctly but in the wrong context, and if you run the grammar check, it will catch those mistakes. Like, For example, affect, there or there, in terms of being over there or their house. These words are all spelled correctly, but if you use it in the wrong place, then they're misspelled. And if you do the grammar check, it will catch them. So it's really important that you always spell and grammar check before posting your work. Nikki, which video said that not to use the I? One of the videos from the past? Because every instructor has different preferences, so I would recommend that you follow your instructor's recommendations, because ultimately he or she is the one that's grading. John, do you recommend that they do not use I or we in your, I don't know if you're doing Echo 201, or Peter, I know you two are here tonight. I teach more often macroeconomics, and followed the webinars for macroeconomics when Nicole was holding them, so I didn't really. But this has never been an issue in the previous webinars that we've held for the past 2 semesters. But ultimately, follow your instructor's guidelines, because he or she is the one that's grading, and you obviously want to meet the expectations of your instructor to get a good grade. Now you can ask the question, and you can bring up this template to say that the template recommends the I or we, if that is your preference or you feel more comfortable using that form, and see what answer you get. But let me see. It looks like my thing wasn't. Oh, you do Echo 201, okay. Well, Angel, I know when you took English, it said not to use it, but it is in this particular instance, you are being a consultant for the company, and it would kind of be, it's like you're writing an economic report of your company. So when you're writing a report, you would use I and we, because you are writing it, you know, like in the business world, you wouldn't use the indirect, the passive form. Now in English, it's different if you're writing something. So, yeah, Peter, see, you don't. And John likes I. It really depends on the instructor. Most of the instructors will let you use the I. So if it's not the instructor from your microeconomics class that specifically told you not to use the I, you can use it. So, oh, these links are not working. Let me see if they work for me. But so these links are links from the My Econ Lab, if I'm not correct, the digital vellum, Wendy. And so yes, Nikki, the animated video and the link doesn't work. If you go in My Econ Lab of your classroom and you go in the My Econ Lab resources, you are able to select module by module, actually I think chapter by chapter, the videos, the animated videos, and the PowerPoints associated to the chapters that you're reading. And these links that your professors have been giving you are from the My Econ Lab. And for some, I don't know why they're not working, because if he got it from the My Econ Lab of the class you're taking, they should work. But you can circumvent this problem by going directly into the My Econ Lab yourself and going to the resource page, and they'll work. And so if you're doing the chapter, I don't know, chapter 4, for example, chapter 3, I think, is demand and supply, you can open that chapter and you can find the animated videos that explain further demand and supply. You can find the PowerPoints, which I think are really useful because they have the graph. They're very, they're summarized really well. So they give you a good overview and a good way to review some information, and also to apply the models if you want to in your paper. Grammarly, Lynette, yes, that's a good source. I'm trying to go back and see what I got a whole bunch of messages all at once instead of gradually. So to find your company, there's also a file provided of recommended companies. The pages we're looking at is how detailed our introduction should be. Lynette, the detail of introduction is not the amount that it shows on here, because this is just a guideline. You probably, for milestone 1, you want, I would say, 1.5 to 2 pages. The introduction would be at least half a page to 3/4, and the history would be about a page, I would say. The history being more detailed than the introduction. Freddie, you raise your hand. I don't see. Lynette, you can get a printed copy by going on the course materials into the final project resources and printing a copy. This is the link of the video that stays not to use I. Nikki, this is not the recommendations of the course. Now, so if it's your instructor that shared this video with you, you can ask him or her if the recommendation not to use an I was just there and maybe they didn't notice it or didn't think you would take it literally, and they gave you the video for different information, like to find other information. So you just want to ask your instructor. But the general recommendation is to use the I or the we. Yes, Valencia, this is milestone 1. Milestone 1 is pretty short, so we got over it really fast because all you need to provide is an introduction to the company, and then you need to provide a history of the company. The history needs to be a detailed and comprehensive history of the company. If it's not comprehensive, so when the company was founded, who founded it, what does it produce, what kind of goods or services, and a little bit of how it has evolved through the years to be what it is today. So the history is not an economic perspective of the company, it's just literally a description of the company and its history, like you would be writing a biography of a person, just you're writing it of a company. So oh, you're welcome. Wendy, yes, the videos in the Pearson textbook should be the same, because that link looks like the same link as the My Econ Lab. Oh, thank you, John, for answering, Angel. Because I didn't see the question. They're going too fast. In the case of a multinational company, do I focus only on US? You can focus, like John said, you can focus on both markets. When you do supply and demand, you might just want to do the US market if it gets too complicated, just because the consumer habits can be different in Europe, for example, than they can be in the US. Maybe not for cell phones or something obvious like electronics, but for clothing, for example, sports apparel, there might be a different type of demand. Yes, Jesse, macro starts at 9. So Wendy's asking, for milestone 1, I'm having difficulties understanding the section that says outline the purpose of your final project research paper and explain how it will inform your conclusion. Anna says, the reason that the introduction in the example paper is so detailed is because the person would have gone back to add detail after milestone 1. Yes, so in the introduction you're going to write now, you're just going to explain what you're going to do for the paper. So I suggest you open up the rubric for the final project, which contains information in general of the whole research you're going to do. It gives you the guidelines for the whole final. And thanks to those guidelines, you'll be able to understand what kind of research you're going to conduct throughout the 8 weeks of class, and use that information to explain what kind of research you're going to conduct through these 8 weeks and why you're conducting this research. You're doing economic research report because you want to be able to provide recommendations to your company. So that is how it will inform your conclusion, is that at the end of the paper, you will be able to provide recommendations for future growth for your company based on the information you research throughout the Can you show us a full milestone? I can show you, let me see if I have the sample paper, but I'm not sure I have it. Let me see. I don't think I have. There used to be a sample paper that was shared, but it's not anymore in the classrooms, because then it prevents students from using. Let me see if this is it. No, this is the final project guidelines. So this is what I was talking about when you try to read your introduction. You can, if you read this whole the overview of the final project guidelines, you will be able to identify what your research is going to be throughout the course to write your introduction. And in fact, it also provides you additional information on the milestone, but this first part mostly explains what the whole purpose of your paper and your research is going to do. We have yes, you have the sample paper. Oh, yeah, it's still there then. The sample paper is in the final project supplemental resources. So you can go there, you can open it, you can get an idea of an exemplary sample paper, what it looks like, how long it is, each section. Thank you, John, for sharing the citation guidelines. Lisa, Purdue OWL is a really good source to use for APA formatting. Thank you for sharing that. Todd, this paper is written in the context of your analysis of the firm. When you provide your recommendations, they can be based on your opinion, but they also must be based on the obviously on the results and the data you find in your research. So, I mean, if your recommendation is totally off base because it does not reflect your research, I mean, it can be debated, right? It has to be a convincing recommendation based on your research. So, for example, if your company has suffered from a price change and demand has decreased, showing a high price elasticity of demand, in your recommendations, you would not recommend them to raise their prices, obviously. You would recommend them to have more control over their prices because their price elasticity of demand is high. Does that make sense? Because one of the parts of the recommendation is based on the demand trends and the price elasticity you have observed, for example. Another recommendation is based on the market positioning you have observed for your firm. So the recommendations you're providing are specific to the research you have made, you have carried out. So Freddie, like Lisa, no, like Hannah explained, the sample paper is in the section Final Project Supplemental Resources. We have another minute if you have any more questions, and then we're going to move over to macroeconomics, ECHO 202. Let me see. This, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available online tomorrow on the ECHO SNHU YouTube channel, and your instructors should be also sharing it through the announcements. Lynette, your answer to the conclusions, you're basically going to provide recommendations for your firm. You don't have the answer now because you haven't done the whole final. The introduction, you have to explain how your research will inform your conclusions. So you're basically explaining that the research you're doing will provide you the information necessary, will give you the information necessary to provide recommendations to your firm for the future. So that's how it will inform your conclusion. Hello, Yolan. I'm gonna close Echo 201. Is it not up to date on the website that we access from the suggest? Nikki, the data on the website from the suggested firm list, I know they've provided some financial reports on the course, but that I think they're dated 2015 or 16. You also have to go on the website to get more recent reports for your firm. But if you go on the website, on the company's website, the information will be up to date. Good night, everyone, for Echo 201. We're shutting down microeconomics, and you are welcome. And we are going to switch over to Echo 202. Let's see. Let me find it. John, thank you for helping. Peter, I'm not sure. That's not what I wanted to find. Let me find the correct document. Let me see if this is it. Here it is, I think. Look, oh, there it is. Okay. I did my paper on Netflix. Jesse, Netflix is a good company to research for microeconomics. Yes, the webinars are always going to be Echo 201 first and Echo 202 second. So at 9 o'clock, we switch over to macroeconomics, Echo 202. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kiara Yates. I'm sitting in for Nicole Soto on the webinars. You're welcome, Nikki. Hi, Daph. So I'm sitting in for Nicole Soto on the webinars. I mostly teach macroeconomics, Echo 202, like this semester. And I've been teaching for Southern New Hampshire since 2012. Now, the milestones and the final for Echo 202 are in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. Hi, everybody. And so this might be a little bit more challenging in terms of format, because I know that some of you might not be quite as familiar with PowerPoint presentations. And I want to make sure that you all use your instructor. Talk to your instructor if you have trouble with the presentation, you don't know how to use PowerPoint very well. Your instructor can give you some resources on how to use PowerPoint better. Adrian, is anybody else having problem with the audio? Cutting in and out? No, it's all clear. So Adrian, I think it might be on your side. And sorry if I missed some questions while I'm talking. I will try to answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. We'll have time for all the questions, and then I'll be able to read the chat box better. So as I was saying, if you have trouble with PowerPoint, I invite you and I encourage you to go to your instructor and ask for help. The content in your PowerPoint needs to be developed in the slides where you will have the main points of your content, but then you have to develop all the actual economic review in the speaker notes. So I want to make sure that you know what the speaker notes are and how to access them. And I'm going to give you a link on how to add speaker notes to your PowerPoint. Here it is. This is a YouTube video. It's really useful. So let's get this out of the way. This YouTube video is to add speaker notes to presentations. Your content has to all be developed in the speaker notes. If you don't develop the speaker notes, you will not be able to be proficient for the milestones nor for the final. You will have an introductory slide that has just the name. Basically, you're going to write the title, which will be the decade you chose. You chose your decade during Module 1, Discussion 1, and you shared it with the class. You can provide a 10-year period introduction and overview of your decade. You don't have to go in a lot of detail for this introduction, just maybe provide the main highlights of your decade. This slide is not part of the rubric grading, so you won't, you don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Just provide a few highlights for your decade and then move on to what the most important part of the milestone is, which is for milestone 1, you will be researching some macroeconomic factors. So you will be researching the GDP, the gross domestic product, and growth. You'll be researching unemployment, inflation, and interest rates. So in the first slide, you will want to absolutely use graphs for all the slides, actually, to show the trends of GDP, inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. You will not be able to show the trends just by listing numbers in your content. So you either choose a graph or you can choose a table. The best website to get the graph is Fred. Fred is the Federal Reserve website of St. Louis. If you go on there, you write GDP, a graph will come up. Then you can select the decade. You can specify from 1980, 1 January 1980 to 31 December 1990, and you get your decade up. Once you get your decade, you have your graph. If you go in the top right-hand corner, it'll show you can download it. And you can download it to PowerPoint, which means it'll open up a PowerPoint and there'll be a slide with your graph, and then you can just copy and paste that graph into your PowerPoint. That is the best way to do it. You put a graph on the slide, and then in the speaker notes, you explain the trends for your decade. So here it says, show a graph of real GDP growth rates. That's the other thing. You want to explain the growth rates. So when you find the GDP, you also want to find the growth rates. So what the difference between the GDP graph and the growth rate graphs is the GDP graph will be in billion of dollars, while the growth rates will be in percentage change from year to year. And you can see how the growth will increase and decrease, and it'll give you a better visual of what the trends of the decade are. There is an example. You should have a sample in the final project supplemental resources. There's a sample of a final project that a student completed that has the slides and the speaker notes. Jesse, in the speaker notes, you really need to develop the speaker notes almost like it would be an essay, with paragraphs, citations, references. It's not bullet points, it's literally speaking. It's almost like if you were to present that PowerPoint in a classroom, you would use the speaker notes to write exactly what you would say. So you don't use the speaker notes as bullet points or ideas on what you would say, but you would develop your speech in those speaker notes. Yes, Floyd, I would do semi-annual is too much. Annual would be sufficient for the graph. Emma, you're referring to models. Which models are you referring to? You don't need any models for the GDP slides. Specifically, you will need to use some models or examples in the next slide. For the GDP, all you need to do is identify the GDP and growth trends. Now, it's really important that you identify the growth trends, which is the percentage change per year. You can use the GDP formula to do it, or you can just find a graph with the growth trends, which saves you having to apply specific models developed throughout the course to demonstrate how these events influence national output during this time. So this is the second slide that you would do for GDP. Once you've identified the GDP trends and the growth trends, you have to identify events that affected the GDP and growth, basically. The events we're talking about are not fiscal or monetary policies, because the fiscal and monetary policies are intended to affect the GDP. The recession is not an event, because the recession is the economic outcome caused by an event. So, for example, if you're researching the 2000s, events would be the housing bubble or the Wall Street crash, the Twin Towers, the technology bubble that caused the recession at the beginning of the decade. Elvin, the settings to use. When you go on Fred, you can just select your 10-year period and you want to have it on an annual basis. And then when you look at Fred on the right-hand corner, you can save and download your graph. If we finish going over the presentation fast enough, I will be happy to open up an internet window and show you how to use Fred. But we need to get through the presentation first. Then I can answer all the questions that you have. Beth, yes, Fred is a site with graphs. The information you deduct, your analysis comes from what you've been reading in the textbook, what you're learning, and what you're observing from the graphs, and also what you will research about your decade. By doing further research, you can use the Federal Reserve website, other Federal Reserve websites. You can use the White House website, and you'll have information on your decade, or the history website. That's also too. So let's move on. The second slide regarding growth and GDP, I said, will identify the events that affected the decade. And as I said, the events need to be historical or current events. They should not be policies. So they should not be fiscal or monetary policies, which you will examine in Milestone 2 and Milestone 3. So in the 80s, events could be, you know, all the policies that conducted to the end of the Cold War, for example, the defense spending investment. Those, even though that's a government policy, it was not intended to spur the economy. It was intended to increase defense measures. If you do the 60s, you would have the Vietnam War. In the 50s is the Korea War. In the 90s, the big technology boom. So every decade has some events that impacted the economy, either positively or negatively. Once you've developed the GDP, you can move on and you can start researching unemployment and inflation. Again, here you have to identify trends. To identify the trends, you would go on Fred again. You can download a graph for unemployment trends and a graph for inflation trends. Another good website to find unemployment trends is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's bls.org. That is a very good website to find all the information you need about unemployment. And in this case, you not only find the graph, but you would find writing about it. So for example, you would find out how the data is collected to calculate unemployment. The monthly surveys they do to collect unemployment information and determine the unemployment rate. Once you have identified these unemployment and inflation rates, in the speaker notes, you will compare the unemployment and inflation trends to the growth and GDP trends you researched in slide 1. And that is, again, you might apply some economic models that show that usually when there's a growth in the economy, the GDP is growing, unemployment would decrease. And so you want to identify those trends. At the same time, so it would be unemployment versus GDP and inflation versus GDP. You want to relate the trends of these two factors to the trends of the GDP. So it says here, discuss how changes in both are related to changes in GDP growth. Again, here you will also identify events that impacted the economy, and you can use the same events that you identified for the GDP slides and use them for unemployment and inflation and explain how those events affected unemployment and inflation. So, for example, in the 1990s, you had the technology bubble, the technology boom, and the technology boom would have reduced unemployment, helped reduce it because everybody was working in that part of the country in the technology boom. At the same time, in the 2000s, when there was the fall, the financial collapse and the fall of, the housing bubble critically reduced jobs in the construction industry. There were no jobs in the finance industry, and so unemployment increased. And so those events affected unemployment and inflation, and you can explain that. So you can use the same events you use for the GDP. Bonnie, the slides are available in the course under the final project supplemental resources. And if you notice, these slides have some blue hyperlinks in them. If you click on them, they won't work unless you're running the slide. But if you right click on them, they will link you to some resources, additional resources you can use while you're doing your research. Crystal, thank you for answering Rachel. You can keep the font the way it is. If you are comfortable with PowerPoint, you can change it. You can even open a brand new PowerPoint and start from scratch and not even use the template. But if you're not comfortable with PowerPoint, I would suggest you stick to the template. The template has been created for you guys to use, so you don't have to figure out PowerPoint too much. Yes, Floyd. So if you right click on those blue links, it'll direct you. For example, with Fred, with the GDP slide, there's a link to Fred. In here, there's a link to other resources like find the data on inflation rates, and on the unemployment rates, it'll direct you to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Once you have developed unemployment and inflation, which would probably be at least 2 slides, because you would have one slide showing unemployment and inflation trends on the slide, and then in the speaker notes, you would explain the relation between those trends and the GDP trends. And then on the second slide, you identify the events, use the same events you used in the GDP, this way it's easier, and you explain how those events affected unemployment and inflation. And then you can go to interest rates. Now, when you do the interest rates slide, again, you need to analyze the interest rate fluctuations. The easiest way to analyze the fluctuations is to find interest rate trends. So use websites again to show how interest rates went up and down. You can use the federal funds rate, the bank prime loan rate, because they all pretty much, they will fluctuate in the same way. So they'll still give you a good picture of the fluctuations and the trends throughout the decade. Now, once you have identified the fluctuations in the speaker notes, so when it says to discuss the following, you will make that discussion in the speaker notes. How did these fluctuations affect or be affected by inflation? So how did they affect inflation, and how inflation might have affected the interest rates? For example, in the 1970s, there was hyperinflation, and so it was the inflation that guided the Federal Reserve to change the interest rates and to adapt and to try and fight inflation. In other decades, it was a little bit the contrary. Interest rates were implemented to change inflation, maybe. Like, for example, in the 2000s, the interest rates were kept really low because of all the high government spending. The Federal Reserve was just trying to keep inflation low. Would investments and foreign trade rates increase or decrease? So when the interest rates are higher, do you think investments would increase or decrease? If it's more costly to get a loan for a company to expand, for example, because interest rates are high, investments are likely to decrease. What would happen to foreign trade? When interest rates affect foreign trade because interest rates affect the currency, affect the value of the dollar. If the value of the dollar is higher, foreign trade will be affected because we won't be able to export as many goods because our goods are too expensive for foreign countries. The opposite will happen if the value of the dollar is lower, we'll be able to export more. If the value of the dollar is lower, we will import less because it's more costly for us to pay for products from other companies. So that is what you need to explain regarding the interest rates. Looking at the fluctuations, you can explain how those interest rates would have affected inflation, investment, foreign trade, and how the GDP would have been affected by the interest rates, the interest rate fluctuations. So it says to answer the above questions, consider the relationship between interest rates and GDP, and there's a link there that will guide you to a resource that you can use. Once you have developed these 3 slides, you're done. You will only need an additional slides for references. The references don't need to be listed in the speaker notes. You can list them directly. Chris, when I say speaker notes, I'm literally talking of the notes that appear under the slide. So this is the main slide that you see where it says interest rates 1 or 2 slides. On the slide, you will put just relevant content, basically, just like bullet points and main concepts. And then in the speaker notes, which is a box that appears below the speaker notes, you will be able to develop your content in the form of paragraphs, sentences and paragraphs. And there's the thank you, Crystal. Did you say that there is a sample available to look at for reference? Yes, Kayla, there should be a sample PowerPoint in the final project supplemental resources in the course. Yes, Nicole, the speaker notes need to be in a cohesive order like a regular paper. So no, it wouldn't be a question answer format. No, it would be you answer the questions, but you answer it in like writing a paragraph, basically. Jillian, the speaker notes don't have a specific length. If they're comprehensive and they answer all the questions required by, all the content required by the rubric, they can be short but comprehensive. So there isn't a length. On the sample project, it doesn't have graphs or for interest rate slides. Do we need to include this? Floyd, you want to analyze the fluctuations. So if you don't have a graph, you might want a table to show the trends, because you wouldn't be able to show if interest rates went up and down if you didn't have something to illustrate it with. So I recommend that you show a graph or at least a table with the interest rate fluctuations. Yes, basically your speaker notes are like a paper, a brief essay where you explain each slide. Yes, Yolan, the speaker notes should be in paragraph form. The YouTube link to the speaker notes, it's not available in Brightspace. That's a link I use in my class for students that are not well acquainted with PowerPoint, so that they can learn how to use the speaker notes. But Kristen, this webinar is recorded, and we'll be uploading it to YouTube. So tomorrow you can go on SNHU, Echo SNHU, and find it and get any link you need from it, or your instructor will share it in the announcement. In the previous slide, it references ASAD for final. Oh, that's the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. For the final draft, look at the ADAS model to illustrate how events led to the changes. Once you will go through the course, you will know the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. If you've taken microeconomics, it's basically an evolution of the demand and supply model applied to the whole economy, not just to the demand and supply of a company. So aggregate demand would be the demand of the whole country's economy, and aggregate supply would be the supply of the whole country's economy. And in the point that they intersect, that is the level of GDP and price levels in a country. So once you get to the end of the course, you will be able to implement that model to be exemplary, or just to develop better your content in the unemployment and inflation slides. Oh, you're welcome. Once you get to the final, you will see there's an extra category, which is the exemplary category. So for example, in the unemployment and inflation slide, you will have to explain how the data is collected and calculated to obtain unemployment and inflation. For unemployment, for example, it's a monthly survey conducted on 20,000 households where they literally call and ask all the employment and unemployment information of the family. For inflation, it's based on the CPI index usually. And so you would explain how the CPI index is derived to then get to inflation. And when you add that explanation, you can be exemplary in the final. For the final draft bit means we don't need it for milestone 1, right? Yes. So because it's for the final draft, you will not need the ADAS model to illustrate how events led to changes observed in both, because you have not reached that level. I think in module 2, you start reading about ADAS, its chapter, and so you don't have enough knowledge and textbook reading to be able to do that last bit. Yes, I can show you Fred. Let me prepare it and I will show you. So Fred, you have to bear with me because while Fred is open, here it is. Okay, let me go on the main page and share it with you. Okay, share my screen. Oh, it won't let me. Okay, I might not be able to share Fred because it doesn't like me. Let me see. It's not letting me share Fred for some reason. Okay. Let me just see if I can get this working. Because it's saying something about Safari, although I'm using Firefox. So, let me see here. What I can do. Okay, here's Fred. Let me see if I can. So I don't want to lose you guys by accident. Okay. Preferences. Privacy. Let me see if it'll let me. Okay. Location camera. Da-da-da. It is not letting me open up, share my screen for some reason. So I won't. I will have to do the Fred another time because something has changed. I've always shared it and now it's not letting me share it. What I can do is, let me see if I can do a screenshot of it for you. And Internet, Safari. I don't even know why it would want Safari to do it. Let me see if I can share it through Safari. And then that will do it. But basically, when you go on Fred, there's a search line on the top where you would write GDP. You don't even need to put the years, to be honest. You can put growth or you can put real GDP. It's really important that you do the real GDP, not the nominal GDP, simply because the real GDP gives you an adjustment for inflation, which the nominal GDP does not give you. And once you go there, Fred, once you find it, the graph appears. It's a big graph. The page will be filled up with the graph, and you can slide. There's two sliders on the bottom of the graph where you will be able to to determine, like, go from the 80s to the 90s or the 90s to the 2000 and all this. There it is. I think I might have fixed it. Let's see if I can share it now. No, it just does not want me to do it. Flash content from this domain to work properly. I downloaded by mistake a software that's controlling my computer these days, and I am having trouble getting rid of it. So I am not able, until I get rid of everything. Let me see if now I can, there. Let's see if now I can share my screen. No. Okay, it's not happening tonight. I will have to go back on my settings and change something. Sorry about that, guys. But the real GDP, Yolan, yes. You want real GDP, not nominal GDP. You want real GDP. The real GDP is adjusted for inflation, and so that is how you will get a true trend for the growth for the decade. Because the nominal GDP might show that there's always growth, because in billion of dollars, the nominal GDP will always increase. But when you adjust for inflation, you will see that there's ups and downs in the GDP. And so the real GDP will give you the true fluctuation of the economic conditions of the decade. Yes, Floyd, sometimes the percentage change might look negative because there's no growth, basically. And so this is how they determine, after there's 2 quarters of negative growth, so you have a negative growth, then they know that the economy is in a recession. Yes, Anna, use annual frequency. Floyd, you are looking at it right, depending on your decade, which I don't know what decade you're researching, but there will be sometimes a negative growth. And as I said, if it's just 1 quarter of negative growth, it's not a big issue. If it's 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, they call it a recession, which could be just those 2 quarters and then go back to growth. Like it happened in the year 2000 with the technology bubble. The 2000s started with a recession, but it was so shortly lived that by the time the government implemented the fiscal policies, the recession was over. And they still implemented the fiscal policies. In the 1960s, there was never any positive growth. Let me look at that, because I'm not sure that looks quite right. Growth in the 1960s. Let me see. I think there was some growth in the 1960s. Especially, I need to find a graph that goes back to the 1960s. You would look, if the real GDP increases, the numbers of the real GDP increase, there is some growth. You might want to go more into detail and look, even if you're not going to include it in your slide, Floyd, you can still look at the quarters or semi-annual to get a closer look, just for yourself and for your analysis. What would we use for aggregation method? Anna Nicole Nichols, what do you mean what you use for aggregation method? Aggregation of what? I'm not sure what you're referring to. I'm going to take the last couple of questions. So in my presentation, I have growth rate per year. Do I also need to go back and add a GDP slide? You still want to show, if you show the growth rates, you are good. But you also want to show some real GDP data, so you can either show it in the form of a table, if you don't want to have two graphs, but you really want to associate the real GDP data to the growth data to show it. Because sometimes you look at real GDP growth and the numbers grow, but you can't, the real GDP numbers, you can't tell how much the growth is. You can't tell if there's a little growth, like less than 1% or more. So that's how the growth helps. So you really want to use both. The requirements for the rubrics are to have both. So I would add, you don't need to add a whole slide for the GDP, Jonathan. You could just split the slide and have two graphs in it. You can have otherwise a graph for growth, and you can have a table for GDP or the opposite. Oh, are you looking onto Fred? Yes, Yolan, you should include GDP and growth data, both. The requirement is to observe the GDP data and determine growth and analyze the growth. So you really need both. You don't need to select an aggregation method, Anna. You just go on the Fred website, you select your decade, and then you download it. They have the seasonally adjusted GDP. You can use that. That is okay to use. But after you choose annual frequency, there's another option for choosing average, sum, end of period. Yeah, if you don't have to choose the option, just choose the annual frequency, and what you can do is just choose the time period that you have. You don't need additional information or additional data. You really just need the graph that shows the growth or the real GDP trends. In Milestone 2, I will have Fred resolved, and even though the fiscal policies obviously don't need Fred because you're doing it now, I will be able to show you. I'm sorry I can't show you tonight, but something went wrong with my computer with this malicious software that it downloaded that is obviously blocking me from using showing my screen. It's like a protection thing that it's installed on my computer and controlling everything. I tried to use another web browser and it won't let me. The only thing I can think of doing, let me try, is by opening up the Adobe Connect. Let me try and see if I use the app and it might let me do it. Let me see. Because I have an Adobe app, and if I use that, I might be able to get in it sometimes. If I don't lose you. If I lose you for a second, bear with me. Okay, here it is. Let me see if I can get into the classroom like this. And then share it. But unfortunately, I need to resolve this problem. We're running out of time on the, because it's past 9:30. There is, if you go on one of the YouTube videos from the summer, before summer and you search Milestone 1, I think Nicole explained how to use Fred. And then if you go on the YouTube, the Milestone 1 that I did, on the Milestone 1 that I did during the summer, so it was 18 EW5, the semester, 5 or 6. In Milestone 1, I did share Fred. And I did explain. So it was either the 5th semester or the 6th semester of 2018. And I did share Fred and explain how to use it. So if you go on one of the old YouTube videos of Milestone 1, you should be able to see the explanation on how to use Fred. Yes, there's an introductional video on Fred in the final project resources too. That is correct. Because Nicole also explained how to use Fred. If you search Nicole Soto on YouTube, just look for her name. She does on YouTube. You actually can. She did a video on how to use Fred, so you can use that resource also. I might be able to find it for you real quick because she did it for previous classes, but it's available to everybody. She posted it to her page. So I'm going to find it for you. This is her page. Let me see. Videos. Here they are. She has a lot of, she has a video on how to access my Econ Lab resources on there. So here's her link to her website. And you can go on there and you should be able to find how to do the graphs. She also has a video explaining how to do graphs in Excel if you want to make your own graph, for example, and you don't want to get it off the internet. You should be able to find. She has a lot of videos on how to use the instructional resources in Brightspace, how to use my Econ Lab, and how to use Fred. So use that video. Go on her YouTube channel. You will find a lot of videos. You will find also the old milestones that she did. Look for Fred, and you will find the video she created to explain how to use Fred. It's a really good video, and it's much better than me just showing you here in a few minutes because it goes on for obviously longer. If you don't have any more questions, I will close the webinar for tonight because we've gone over the time. And I will see you during Milestone 2 in 2 weeks. Oh, you are welcome. Good night, everybody. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask your instructors. They're there for that. They need to answer your questions and they can help you through the milestones. Also, good night.